They had been told that American soldiers were cowards, weaklings corrupted by jazz and materialism, men without the physical strength or moral fortitude of true Aryan warriors. But when 312 German women stepped off the transport ship into the harbor at New York on June 15, 1946, what struck them most wasn't ideology or propaganda. It was something far more immediate and unsettling. The men waiting for them on the dock were, quite simply, handsome, devastatingly handsome. This wasn't what they had expected. After years of being surrounded by the gaunt, exhausted faces of men broken by war, after seeing the hardened, cold expressions of Nazi officers and SS men, the casual confidence and physical vitality of these American soldiers seemed to belong to another species altogether. They were tall, many of them, with broad shoulders and easy smiles that made no sense given the circumstances. These were men who had defeated Germany, who had liberated concentration camps and borne witness to the worst horrors imaginable. Yet their faces weren't scarred by bitterness. They weren't twisted with hatred or righteousness. They looked improbably happy, or at least they looked alive in a way that the women had almost forgotten was possible. The transport ship cut through the Atlantic with the speed of a vessel designed for efficiency rather than comfort. The women had been processed through various camps in Germany and Austria over the previous weeks, moved from place to place with the administrative precision that Americans seemed to apply to everything they did. They were officers' wives, secretaries, nurses, administrators, women who had served the Reich in various capacities and were now classified as prisoners of war. Most were between 25 and 40 years old, though a few were younger and a few older. They wore whatever remained of their clothing after the sorting and confiscation processes. Some still had pieces of their uniforms. Others wore civilian clothes that had been provided by the Americans, a mix of mismatched items that hung awkwardly on frames that had been made smaller by years of rationing and stress. As the American coast appeared on the horizon, there was an odd electricity in the air that none of them could quite explain. They had expected fear. They had prepared themselves, mentally at least, for whatever came next. The war was over. Germany had lost. Completely, utterly, irrevocably lost. The Reich that Hitler had promised would last 1,000 years had lasted 12, ending in the rubble of Berlin and the deaths of millions. Some of these women had believed in that Reich with all their hearts. Others had simply lived within it, done their jobs, tried to survive. But regardless of their personal histories, all of them knew that they were now the conquered, the defeated, the spoils of a war they had lost. What they didn't know was how to feel about that, or what it would mean for their futures. The ship docked at the military facility in New York with the efficiency that seemed to characterize everything the Americans did. There was no chaos, no shouting, no rough handling. Instead, there were lines and procedures and American officers with clipboards explaining things through translators. The women were to disembark in an orderly fashion. They would be processed, given medical examinations, and assigned to their quarters. No harm would come to them. They were prisoners of war, yes, but they would be treated in accordance with the Geneva Convention. The women descended the gangway slowly, their eyes adjusting to the bright sunlight that seemed almost violent after weeks at sea. And that was when they saw them properly for the first time. The American soldiers waiting to receive them. It was impossible not to stare. Greta, a former secretary at a Wehrmacht administrative office in Munich, felt her breath catch in her throat. She had always considered herself practical, unsentimental, focused on the task at hand rather than distracted by superficial observations. But even she couldn't help but notice the man standing directly in front of her as she stepped onto the dock. He was perhaps 28 years old, with sandy blonde hair, strong features, and a smile that seemed genuinely welcoming. He wore his uniform with the kind of casual confidence that suggested he had never once doubted his right to be wherever he was. He looked at her and nodded politely, then reached down to help her with her bag, as if such courtesy was the most natural thing in the world. For a moment, Greta stood frozen, her hand in his, unable to process what was happening. She had spent the last 6 years in a world where authority was exercised through intimidation and fear. Where men in power expected absolute obedience and brutality was presented as strength. The idea that a soldier could simply be polite, could offer assistance without expectation of anything in return, seemed almost shocking. She took the bag and managed to murmur a thank you in her hesitant English. The soldier smiled again and gestured toward the building where the processing would take place. His kindness, expressed through such small actions, was somehow more disorienting than if he had been cruel. Cruel, at least, would have made sense. Cruelty would have fit the narrative of victors and vanquished. But this casual, unthinking kindness suggested that perhaps the world operated on different principles than she had understood. Ingrid, who had worked as a nurse in a German military hospital in Austria, stood beside Greta and was experiencing her own version of confusion. She had treated wounded soldiers, American included, in the chaotic final days of the war. She had seen men broken by bullets and shrapnel, had learned to function in a world defined by pain and blood and the constant sense of catastrophe. But those men had been suffering, diminished by their wounds. These soldiers seemed untouched by such limitations. They moved with the easy physicality of men who had never experienced true deprivation. They were clean and well-fed, and their skin had color in it, the kind of healthy glow that suggested good nutrition and access to soap and fresh water. This too seemed to mock the women's own appearance. After years of rationing, after the stress of the war's collapse, after the long journey on a ship with minimal facilities, the German women knew they looked terrible. Their skin was sallow, their clothes hung loose, their hair was dull. Some of them had developed medical conditions from the stress and privation of the past years. They looked, in short, like what they were: defeated, wore down, changed by everything they had endured. And these American men, these impossibly handsome American men, were looking at them with expressions that seemed to contain something that might have been pity or kindness, or possibly just curiosity about this strange batch of prisoners that history had delivered to their base. The processing center was a large, clean building that smelled of disinfectant and something else that the women couldn't quite identify. It took them a while to realize it was the smell of abundance, of resources, of a country that had never experienced occupation or true scarcity. The air itself seemed different here, seemed to carry the scent of prosperity. They were led through various stations where their backgrounds were verified, their medical status was checked, and they were assigned to barracks. At each stage, they encountered American soldiers and officers. Some were businesslike and professional. Others seemed genuinely curious about the German women, asking questions through the translators, their interest seeming to go beyond mere official procedure. One young officer, named Captain James Morrison, seemed particularly interested in talking with the women. He was, by any measure, extraordinarily good-looking, tall and broad-shouldered with dark hair and intelligent eyes that suggested he was the sort of man who had been successful at everything he attempted. When he spoke to the women, he did so in a way that conveyed respect, as if their thoughts and opinions were genuinely interesting to him rather than simply data points to be recorded. Margot, a former administrative assistant who had worked directly for high-ranking Nazi officials and had therefore developed a keen sensitivity to how power was exercised, found herself watching Captain Morrison with something close to fascination. The way he held himself, the way he listened to what was being said through the translator, the way he thanked people for their time, all of it suggested a completely different model of authority than what she had experienced for the past 6 years. In Nazi Germany, power had been displayed through dominance. Men in positions of authority had made their dominance known through their ability to demand obedience, through fear, through the casual exercise of cruelty that reminded subordinates of their inferiority. But this man, this American captain, seemed to possess authority in a completely different way. He had power, yes, but he didn't need to constantly prove it or defend it. He could afford to be kind because his authority didn't depend on fear. It seemed to depend on something else entirely. Competence, perhaps, or simply the confidence that came from being backed by a nation whose resources and infrastructure seemed limitless. When the women were finally led to their barracks, they found themselves in a shock of comfort that they hadn't expected. The buildings were clean. The beds had mattresses and springs. There were pillows and blankets. There was even a small stove in each barracks for heat during the cold months. After years of sleeping on thin pallets or military cots, the prospect of sleeping on these actual beds seemed almost luxurious. That first night, as Greta lay in her bunk listening to the sounds of the American military base around her, she found herself thinking about the soldier who had helped with her bag. She couldn't stop replaying the moment in her mind, analyzing his face, his expression, trying to determine what she had seen there. Kindness, yes, but also something else. A kind of openness that suggested he didn't see her as a threat or as an enemy in any meaningful sense. He had been trained to consider her an adversary, had been sent to Germany to defeat her nation, had been part of the force that had reduced her country to rubble. And yet he had smiled at her with the kind of genuine warmth that suggested he held no personal animosity toward her whatsoever. It was disconcerting. It was also, she had to admit to herself in the privacy of her own thoughts, somewhat attractive. Breakfast the next morning arrived at 6 o'clock, delivered to the barracks by American soldiers. The women were stunned to find that they had been assigned their own private kitchen area with access to cooking facilities. The ingredients provided were abundant and of a quality that seemed almost obscene given what they had become accustomed to eating. There was bacon, eggs, bread, butter, jam, fresh milk, coffee, and oatmeal with sugar and cream. The last time most of these women had seen food in such quantities was years before the war ended. Ingrid sat down with her breakfast and found that tears were actually forming in her eyes at the simple sight of it. She had spent so much time being practical, being efficient, doing what needed to be done, that she had almost forgotten what it felt like to be moved emotionally by something as simple as food. Now, staring at her plate, she felt the weight of years of scarcity and stress wash over her. She ate slowly, trying to savor each bite, trying to make her meal last longer, and trying to understand what it meant that the enemy was providing this for them. Throughout the day, the women were assigned to various work details. Some were sent to work in the administrative offices, utilizing their language skills and clerical experience to help process paperwork related to the occupation and the management of resources in defeated Germany. Others were assigned to work in the kitchen, the laundry, or in maintenance around the base. None of it was backbreaking labor. In fact, most of it seemed designed to be manageable and non-dangerous. The soldiers supervising the work details were universally polite and often seemed to go out of their way to make the tasks easier than they strictly needed to be. Greta found herself assigned to work in the main office, alongside the captain she had noticed during processing. Her job was to help organize German language documents and to serve as a translator for official communications. It was challenging work that required her full concentration, but it also meant that she spent a significant portion of her day in close proximity to Captain Morrison. She found this deeply unsettling. She had been trained her entire life to see men in positions of power as figures to be respected and feared, not to be observed with the kind of personal interest that she found herself experiencing now. And yet, she couldn't seem to prevent herself from being aware of him in a way that went beyond professional necessity. The way he moved through the office, his interactions with the other soldiers, his thoughtful engagement with the work they were doing together, all of it fascinated her in a way that she felt she should be ashamed of, but somehow wasn't quite able to summon that shame. She was, after all, a prisoner of war, an enemy, the defeated subject of a nation that had started the most destructive war in human history. What right did she have to find anyone attractive, let alone her captor? And yet, she did. She found him attractive. Devastating so. For the first week, the main topic of conversation in the women's barracks was this simple, uncomfortable fact. They couldn't stop talking about the American soldiers, couldn't stop noticing how good-looking they were, couldn't stop being bewildered by this observation. Margot, always more willing to speak bluntly about uncomfortable truths, was the one who finally articulated what they were all thinking. "They're beautiful," she said one evening as the women prepared for bed. "The Americans are beautiful, and that's deeply disturbing to me because I was raised to believe that German men represented the apex of human physical development. We were told that we should seek out men who embodied German ideals, that racial purity was visible in physical form, that beauty was tied to the supposed superiority of our people. And now I look at these American men, and they're not German. Many of them aren't even blonde, and they're still absolutely beautiful. She paused, looking around at the faces of the other women. What does that do to all of our certainties? What does it mean when the enemy turns out to be beautiful? It was a question that hung in the air, unanswered because there was no good answer. The certainties they had been raised with were crumbling. They had been taught that Americans were soft, that they lacked discipline, that they were culturally inferior and physically weak. What they were seeing, instead, was men who combined physical strength with a kind of easy confidence that suggested they had nothing to prove. They had won the war. They didn't need to posture or display dominance aggressively. Their victory was complete and self-evident. Over the next weeks, a rhythm emerged that began to feel almost normal, which was its own kind of disturbing. The women woke early, ate breakfast, performed their work assignments, ate lunch, continued working, ate dinner, and spent their evenings either in their barracks or in a recreation area that had been designated for them. The recreation area contained books, a radio, and materials for various handicrafts. It was not luxurious, but it was comfortable. They were allowed to write letters home, and paper and pens were provided for this purpose. The mail that arrived in return was sporadic and often took months to reach them, but it did arrive, and with it came news from a Germany that was attempting to rebuild itself from complete devastation. The women learned through these letters that their families were surviving, though often barely. Food was scarce in Germany. The cities were rubble. But life, in a diminished form, was continuing. The guilt that this knowledge created was extraordinary. They were eating well while their families searched for food in bombed-out buildings. They were sleeping in warm beds while their relatives shivered through winters in shelters cobbled together from whatever materials could be found. They were being treated with basic dignity while the nation they had served was being dismantled and its former leadership was being put on trial for crimes against humanity. It was this guilt, more than anything else, that began to transform their experience in captivity. Ingrid, working in the kitchen, began to understand food in a completely different way. She saw the abundance of supplies arriving each day, understood that a significant portion of it was being provided to the German prisoners through the benevolence of the American military command. She found herself grateful for this in a way that was complicated by shame. How could she feel gratitude toward the men whose country had destroyed her own? And yet, she did. She felt genuine gratitude, and this gratitude began to crack open something inside her. The propaganda she had absorbed over years of exposure to Nazi ideology had presented American culture as shallow, materialistic, and fundamentally inferior to German culture. But what she was witnessing suggested something different. This wasn't the behavior of people who were materialistic in the crude sense she had been taught to understand it. Rather, it seemed like the behavior of people who had access to resources and who believed that the humane use of those resources involved caring for people, even people who had been their enemies. The American soldiers seemed to operate under a different moral framework than the one she was familiar with. They could defeat you completely and then feed you. They could win the war and then treat the defeated with basic respect. This seemed, to her, to represent a different kind of strength than the strength she had been taught to recognize. It wasn't the strength of dominance through fear. It was the strength of a people confident enough in their victory that they could afford to be merciful. This realization was profoundly disturbing to the women because it suggested that everything they had been taught about the relative worth of different nations and people was fundamentally wrong. If German culture was supposed to be superior, and yet here were Americans demonstrating, through their actions, a more humane approach to victory, then perhaps German culture wasn't as superior as they had been told. Perhaps the entire ideological structure they had been raised within was built on a foundation of lies. One evening, Captain Morrison approached Greta while she was working late in the office. He asked if he could sit down and talk with her for a moment. She nodded, feeling her heart rate increase in a way that she found embarrassing. He asked her how she was adjusting to her captivity, whether she was being treated well, whether she had any concerns about her living conditions or her work assignment. The questions seemed genuine, asked with an interest that went beyond official concern. When she answered, she found herself being more honest than she had expected to be. She told him that she was being treated well, far better than she had feared. She mentioned the guilt she felt at her own relative comfort while her family in Germany struggled. She found herself explaining the fundamental disorientation of her experience, this displacement between what she had been taught to expect and what was actually happening. Captain Morrison listened carefully and seemed genuinely moved by what she was saying. He explained that the United States understood that the German people were not monolithic, that many Germans had opposed the Nazi regime or had been coerced into supporting it. He said that the intention was not to punish the German people, but to attempt to rebuild a democratic Germany that would never again threaten peace in Europe. He spoke of ideals with a kind of conviction that suggested he genuinely believed what he was saying, that he wasn't simply repeating propaganda that he had been taught. This conversation marked a turning point in Greta's internal experience of her captivity. She began to understand that the kindness she was experiencing wasn't strategic or manipulative. It was rooted in a genuine belief system. It was the expression of a different way of thinking about human beings and human relationships. This understanding was both liberating and deeply unsettling. By the autumn of that first year, the women's barracks had developed a kind of subculture. There were heated debates about the American soldiers, about the nature of their attractiveness, about what it meant that they found themselves attracted to men who represented everything they had been taught to oppose. Some of the women, particularly the older ones or those who had been deeply committed to Nazi ideology, maintained a kind of defensive hostility. They refused to engage in friendly conversation with their captors. They ate the food, but took no pleasure in it. They maintained that the Americans were still the enemy, that to find them attractive was a betrayal of Germany itself. But others, particularly younger women who had been less thoroughly indoctrinated, began to engage more openly with the Americans they encountered. They learned English more quickly and with more enthusiasm. They participated in the recreation activities that were offered. They allowed themselves to be friendly in ways that would have been unthinkable in Germany. Margot found herself drawn toward understanding American culture in ways she hadn't expected. She discovered American music through the radio in the recreation area. She listened to jazz and big band music and found herself enjoying it despite having been taught that it was the degenerate product of African American culture corrupted by Jewish influences. She read American novels and found them deeply moving in ways that challenged her previous understanding of what American literature could be. She attended movie nights where American films were shown and discovered that she responded emotionally to stories told through this medium in ways she hadn't anticipated. The physical attractiveness of the American soldiers, which had been the initial point of fascination, began to merge with an appreciation for the cultural and ideological differences they represented. They were attractive not just because of their physical appearance, though that was certainly part of it, but because they represented a different way of being in the world. They represented a culture that had won the war because it had more resources and better military strategy, yes, but also because it was built on a different set of assumptions about human nature and human rights. This realization began to create a kind of cognitive dissonance among the women that was almost painful in its intensity. To appreciate American soldiers was to admit that America might be superior in some ways. To find American culture interesting was to question the teachings that had been central to her entire upbringing. To recognize that the Americans treated defeated prisoners with more humanity than German soldiers had treated their own subordinates was to admit that the entire moral framework she had been raised within was built on foundations that were fundamentally corrupt. By winter of the first year, some significant changes had begun to manifest in the women's behavior and attitudes. There was less hostility in their interactions with their American supervisors. There was more engagement with the learning opportunities that were being offered. There was an openness to connection that suggested that the women were beginning to process and integrate new ways of understanding themselves and the world. The American military command seemed to notice and approve of these changes. The conditions of their captivity, which had already been relatively comfortable, improved further. They were allowed more recreational time. They were given access to better clothing. They were permitted to participate in some community activities on the base, including occasional dances or entertainment events where American soldiers and German prisoners could interact socially. It was at one of these dances that Greta found herself dancing with Captain Morrison. The experience was surreal. She was a prisoner of war dancing with an American officer in a military recreation hall. There was a military band playing music, American music, and around her were other pairs of German women and American men, dancing together in a scene that would have been inconceivable just months earlier. Captain Morrison danced well, leading her with confidence and grace. They didn't talk much, but there was a kind of communication happening through their movement together that went beyond language. When the dance ended, he walked her back to the barracks and thanked her for the dance. That night, in her bunk, Greta found herself unable to sleep, her mind replaying the experience over and over. She was attracted to him. She was attracted to an American soldier, her captor, the representative of a nation that had defeated her own. And perhaps more troubling than the simple fact of this attraction was the realization that it represented something more significant than simple physical desire. She was beginning to see him, and by extension, the American soldiers she encountered, as human beings rather than as enemies or abstractions. This shift in perception was powerful and disorienting. During the winter, mail arrived from Germany that brought difficult news. Greta received a letter from her mother explaining that her father, having survived the war, had been suffering from health complications that were now worsening. Medical care in Germany was limited, and there was no certainty that he would survive. Ingrid received word that her sister's family had lost their home in a fire and were living in a camp for displaced persons with limited access to food and medical care. Margot learned that a close friend had died of tuberculosis, a preventable disease that had become fatal due to the lack of medical resources in defeated Germany. The knowledge of these family tragedies, arriving in the relative comfort and security of the American camp, created an almost unbearable sense of guilt and helplessness. The women gathered in their barracks and allowed themselves to grieve, and in their grief, they spoke more openly than they had before about the contradictions of their experience. Ingrid, tears streaming down her face, said something that many of them had been thinking but had been afraid to articulate aloud. "I want to go home," she said, "but I'm terrified to go home because I know what I'll find there, and I know that I've been eating and sleeping well while my family has been suffering. How will I face them? How will I explain that I'm healthier now than I've ever been in my life while they're starving?" The question hung in the air, unanswered, because there was no adequate answer. They were living better in captivity than they would in their defeated homeland. This was an inversion of everything they had been taught about national pride and loyalty. In her mind, Greta found herself comparing the American captain to the German officers she had known before the war. The German officers had demanded obedience and discipline. They had created a hierarchical structure built on domination and fear. The captain, by contrast, had treated her with respect, had asked for her opinions, had allowed her to maintain her dignity even while she was his prisoner. He had shown her that it was possible for a man to exercise authority without relying on intimidation or the projection of superior dominance. This comparison, once made, couldn't be unmade, and it implied a whole set of other comparisons between German and American culture, between Nazi ideology and democratic principles, between the way the world could be organized according to competing systems of belief. By the spring of the second year, rumors began circulating that the German prisoners would soon be repatriated to Germany. Plans were being made for their return. Arrangements were being worked out with the German government for their integration back into German society. The news should have brought joy, or, at the very least, some sense of closure. Instead, many of the women experienced it as a kind of dread. They had begun lives here, had developed routines, had made connections with American soldiers and officers. The idea of returning to a Germany that was still struggling, still traumatized, still dealing with the aftermath of defeat, seemed overwhelming. Margot was particularly vocal about her resistance to to the idea of leaving. "I don't want to go back," she said firmly. "I want to stay here. I want to continue working in the office. I want to continue learning about American culture and democracy. I want to see what the world looks like when it's not organized around fear and propaganda." Her statement caused a stir among the women. Some agreed with her, seeing in her words an articulation of their own secret thoughts. Others were horrified, seeing such statements as a betrayal of their German identity. But the debate itself reflected the fundamental transformation that had occurred in many of the women's worldviews. They had come to the American base as prisoners, as enemies, as women from a defeated nation. They were beginning to leave, in their minds at least, as people who had been irrevocably changed by exposure to a different way of living and thinking. The day of departure arrived in early May, almost exactly 1 year after they had arrived. The ship that would carry them back to Germany was waiting in the harbor. The women gathered their few possessions, put on the clothing that had been provided for their journey, and prepared to leave the base that had become, in some strange way, a home. As they walked toward the dock, Captain Morrison appeared to say goodbye to Greta. He handed her a small package. Inside, when she opened it later on the ship, she found American textbooks on democracy and political science, along with a letter in which he encouraged her to continue learning, to question the narrative she had been taught, to use her education and intelligence to help rebuild Germany according to different principles than those that had led to the war. He wrote, "You have the ability to be an agent of change in your country. Please use it." Ingrid said goodbye to Helen, the head American nurse she had worked alongside for a year. Helen embraced her and pressed a small bundle into her hands. It contained American medical journals and a note explaining that the knowledge contained in them could help save lives in Germany. She wrote, "You understand now what it means to care for human beings without regard to nationality or ideology. Bring that understanding back to Germany." The voyage back across the Atlantic took 3 weeks. The journey was more difficult than the voyage to America had been. The ship was crowded and the seas were rough. The women were given adequate food, but the accommodations were much more cramped than they had been on the American base. But throughout the journey, the women talked, debated, processed the extraordinary year they had just experienced. The boat that was sailing back to Germany carried women who had been fundamentally transformed by their year in American captivity. They were returning to a nation still reeling from defeat, to families desperate to see them and ask them what had happened to them, to a world that was trying to rebuild itself from the ashes of total war. When they finally arrived at the German port and disembarked, they found a nation transformed but still struggling. The cities were still in ruins, though some reconstruction had begun. The people were still thin, still struggling with shortages of food and basic resources. The government was still being organized under occupation, with 4 different Allied powers administering different zones. It was, in many ways, a heartbreaking sight to come back to, particularly after a year of living in abundance and comparative comfort. Greta returned to Munich to find her family's apartment destroyed, her mother living with relatives in a much smaller space, her father gravely ill from the health complications that had plagued him since the war. Her family embraced her with joy and relief, but she could see the shock in their faces at how healthy she looked, how well-fed she was compared to the general population of Germany, which was still dealing with the aftermath of war and occupation. Over the following months and years, Greta and the other women who had been prisoners in America began to process and integrate what they had experienced. Greta eventually went to university, studied political science and history, and became a teacher and later a scholar of American culture and democracy. She spent her career trying to help Germans understand that there were different ways of organizing society, that democracy was possible, that human rights could transcend nationalism. She maintained correspondence with Captain Morrison for decades, and when he died in 1989, she mourned him as a man who had changed her life by treating her with dignity when she was a prisoner of war. Ingrid returned to nursing, eventually opening a clinic in Berlin that provided health care based on the principles of universal human dignity that she had learned from the American nurses. She trained a generation of nurses to see their patients not as members of competing nations or ideologies, but as human beings deserving of care and respect. She never married, instead devoting her life to healthcare work, inspired by her experience in American captivity. Margot became involved in German politics, working to establish democratic institutions and to combat the remnants of authoritarian thinking that persisted in German society even after the fall of the Nazi regime. She gave speeches and wrote articles about the importance of exposing people to different cultures and ideas, using her own experience of transformation through exposure to American democracy as an example of what was possible when people were allowed to question the narratives they had been taught. The other German women who had been prisoners dispersed across Germany, Austria, and some even chose to remain in the United States, having met and married American soldiers during the occupation period. Some integrated these new experiences into their lives quietly, passing on to their children and grandchildren the lessons they had learned. Others spoke publicly about their experiences, contributing to a growing understanding in post-war Germany that the way forward lay in embracing democracy and rejecting the authoritarian models of the past. The impact of these women's experiences extended far beyond their personal transformations. They became part of a much larger historical process through which a defeated nation was slowly rebuilt according to democratic principles. They helped their communities understand that it was possible for enemies to become partners, that humanity could transcend national boundaries, and that ideology could be questioned and changed through exposure to different ways of thinking and being. Decades later, when historians began to examine the occupation period and the way that defeated nations were reintegrated into the international community, they recognized that the treatment of German prisoners by American forces had played a role in shaping the German response to defeat and occupation. Instead of developing lasting resentment that might have fueled future conflict, a generation of Germans, educated and influenced by American principles of fair treatment and democratic governance, developed a commitment to democracy and international cooperation. The handsome American soldiers who had greeted the German women at the dock in 1946 were part of a much larger historical force. They represented a nation that had the power to impose vengeance and destruction, but had instead chosen, imperfectly and inconsistently, but still meaningfully, to attempt to rebuild rather than to punish. They represented an ideology that believed that human beings had inherent worth regardless of nationality or past allegiance. They represented the possibility of a different kind of world. For the German women who had been their prisoners, the recognition of this possibility, often accompanied by an appreciation for the physical attractiveness of the men who represented it, had catalyzed a transformation that shaped the rest of their lives. In the end, the most dangerous weapon possessed by America during the occupation of Germany was not superior military might, though that certainly existed. It was not economic power, though that was also evident in the abundance that contrasted so starkly with the scarcity of defeated Germany. The most dangerous weapon was the simple demonstration that there was a different way to organize society, a different way to treat human beings, a different way to exercise power. For the German women who had been taught to see enemies and who had found instead allies who treated them with dignity, this realization proved more transformative than any defeat or punishment could have been. It opened their eyes to possibilities they had not previously imagined and set them on paths that led them, and through them, their nation, toward a future built on different foundations than the past.